Morning, everyone. My name is Don Sobelman. I'm a partner here at Farrell, Braun and Martell. I'm the chair of our environmental practice group, and I'm joined here today by Adam Love of Roux, who is one of the preeminent experts in the area of PFAS and has a great deal of experience with PFAS in the context of the wine industry as well as in a number of other industries, both on the compliance side, and he also has extensive litigation experience. And so we are having this is the second in a continuing series of presentations we've done for folks in the wine industry, where we hope to give you an overview of what's going on with PFAS and how it may affect your business. And in this presentation, what we're going to do is start with a brief overview. First, we'll have a technical overview from Adam, and he'll start with a little background on himself, and then talk about PFAS as chemicals and where they come from, where they're found, and where you may be running into them in your business. And then I will do a short section on the legal and regulatory framework for PFAS, kind of where we're at right now, particularly as it may affect the wine industry. And then we'll open it up to questions after that, because we do have a number of folks on, and we want to give you an opportunity to ask us questions that you have. And then, if we run out of questions at that point, Adam and I can certainly continue and have kind of a back and forth about some issues that kind of percolate in our minds that might be of interest to you. But really, the goal is to get all of your questions answered to the extent that we can. So we'll keep our initial presentations fairly short. I'll turn it over first to Adam. He can introduce himself and talk about the technical side.
Great. Thank you, Don. My name is Adam Love. I'm a principal at an environmental consulting firm called Roux Associates. I have been doing this sort of consulting for the better part of the last 25 years. I also happen to have been a commercial winemaker at a small Berkeley, California winery back in the 2000s. So I understand the winemaking processes, I understand vineyard relations and vineyard management practices. And so having had both experiences, I understand how these topics mesh up. Now, when we talk about PFAS, for those who don't know, PFAS are a class of chemicals that were invented back in the 40s and 50s, and that are completely man-made, not natural at all. But they have some pretty miraculous properties that seem to make almost everything they get incorporated into better. They are heat resistant, they are water resistant, they are grease resistant, and for all those purposes, they have gotten incorporated into a whole spectrum of products over the many, many decades since they've been sort of created. But the issue is, I would say in the last 20 years, people have started to have concerns about potential health effects from exposure to these chemicals. And so there are concerns about certain types of cancers. There's concerns about certain types of liver damage, about immune reduction, about pregnancy issues, cholesterol issues. There's a whole spectrum of things that people are suspected about. And the potential health effects of PFAS is really an active research topic. And so while there are lots of concerns, those sorts of things are very hard to tease out as to what are actual real health effects versus stuff that is still a research question. We talked about them being incorporated into lots of different types of materials. They really started out as being incorporated into things that we're familiar with, like Teflon. They also got early on incorporated into things like firefighting foam for fuel fires. But over the years, again, those properties have been great for things like stain-resistant coatings on textiles, right? On furniture, on clothing, water-resistant coatings on jackets and other things like that. They've been incorporated into all sorts of consumer products and cosmetics and cleaning agents. And then industrial processes also use them because they have low friction and heat resistance, which are a pretty great combination in mechanical systems. And so over the years, I would say almost every industry that's looked to see whether or not they make their products better, in fact, they do. And so now, decades later, as you go around and you try to measure for PFAS in the environment, wherever you are able to see it almost everywhere you measure. And so that is something that's been a growing concern now, I would say, for the better part of the last, I would say, 15 years, that we have been looking at, these issues with PFAS contamination in the environment. Where are the sources? Where is it spreading? And just getting our arms around really how ubiquitous this type of contamination can be. In the wine industry, a lot of these, characteristics that make products better don't really apply to the wine industry. But nonetheless, there's really what I think is three primary sources of PFAS impacts and where it can get into the winemaking process. The first is through water sources, right? Whether it's groundwater or whether it's through municipally supplied water. We know that there is extensive groundwater impacts of PFAS all across the country. There are surface water impacts. And so whether you have well water or whether you're drawing water from the municipality, PFAS can be in those water supplies. And those water supplies obviously can get used for irrigation, or they can get used for cleaning, or they can get used occasionally. Some folks out there might use some of the water for dilution. And all of those ways are direct processes where PFAS in water can get into either the grapes themselves or the vats themselves. The second is pesticides. There's a number of different types of fluorinated pesticides that are out there. And those fluorinated pesticides, depending on the specifics of their formulation, can be considered PFAS. Or when they break down in the environment, their degradation products can be considered PFAS. And so those chemicals, again, if they get on the fields, on the grapes, in the soils, those things can ultimately make it into the wine themselves. And in fact, in the last 6 months, there was a study done in Europe where they looked at the potential for PFAS in wine going back decades. And they were able to measure PFAS in wines for many decades in the past. And as you went further back into, like, let's say the 70s, the PFAS sort of disappeared. But in the last few decades, it was quite prevalent. The third area that PFAS can make its way into winemaking is through compost. One of the things that has been identified is PFAS from wastewater treatment plants that gets turned into compost can also be a source of ground contamination that can impact groundwater. And so even if the winery and the vineyard itself isn't using compost, if you're in an agricultural area where your neighbors are using compost, that could affect the groundwater that ultimately that you're drawing from. And so there's a lot of different ways that PFAS can get in, but those are the ones that are the most likely. I talked about the one study that came out in the last 6 months on PFAS in wine in Europe. Those same things that would potentially impact PFAS in Europe are not fundamentally different than what we do here in the US and in California in the wine industry. In addition to that, there was another article that came out in the last 6 months from the beer industry where they measured PFAS in beers across the country. And it turns out they were able to find PFAS in beer as well. Now, beer, of course, uses water as a direct ingredient in the product. And so their PFAS content was more closely tied to the water supply itself. But they have also in the past identified PFAS from the hops as a source for PFAS in beer as well. And so these are just the type of things that sort of have to be out there and on your radar to understand whether or not any of the winemaking operations have these sort of vulnerabilities. Don, you want to talk about some of the regulatory framework?
Yes, I will do that. Thanks, Adam. So just as a brief introduction for myself, as I mentioned, I'm the chair of the environmental practice here at Forella. I've been practicing as an environmental lawyer for over 25 years, and my practice spans environmental compliance and regulatory issues, as well as environmental litigation and also environmental issues that arise in property transactions, which we'll talk about a little bit later today, I think, in the context of acquiring vineyards, for example, or acquiring a winery. Basically, PFAS has been an interesting area to watch evolve from an environmental lawyer's perspective over the last few years, because it was kind of like a slow rolling boulder, and then it picked up speed really quickly and is now kind of flattening everything in its path. At the state level, in particular in California, the legislature, once it got a hold of the idea that these chemicals were a potential health concern, started to really ratchet down on their use, because at the federal level, it wasn't much in the way of regulations on the incorporation of PFAS in products. So the California legislature really took a lead role. It was one of the first states to start legislating. And so in 2020, it took steps to ban PFAS in AFFF firefighting foam, which is essentially one of the biggest uses of PFAS historically, has been in firefighting foam that is used for putting out difficult fires, ones that you can't use water on, like, for example, at oil refineries. AFFF firefighting foam, because so much of it gets used during a fire and it sinks into the ground and into the groundwater table, was believed to be a pretty significant source of PFAS in the environment, as well as the fact that firefighters were being exposed to it in the foam itself. So that was the first step in 2020. And then after that, really each year in the legislative sessions, the California legislature has kept ratcheting down and coming up with new ranges of products that they're essentially precluding the use of PFAS or severely restricting it. So in 2021, they banned it in certain types of food packaging and in juvenile products, so products that would be used by children. Then in 2022, they banned it in cosmetic products. 2022, also textile products, things like apparel and bedding and draperies and upholstery, and then menstrual products in 2024, and so on. And so there's really been a ratcheting down. Now, on the food side, it hasn't happened in the legislature yet, but we can anticipate there will be continuing pressure to phase out PFAS, especially where in most of these products, the question is it intentionally added? And so that's really the goal, is to get it out if it's intentionally added because it was being used for certain properties, as Adam was saying, that were valuable in a product, or also they've also set, depending on the legislation, certain levels that they'll accept. But essentially, the goal is to really push to have PFAS out of products in California. At the federal level, what we've seen is not as much on the product side, but more at the environmental regulation side. And so, especially during the Biden administration, we started to see federal laws start to really address PFAS. So in 2024, after several years of rulemaking activity, two PFAS, PFOA and PFOS, were added to the list of hazardous substances under CERCLA, or which is known as Superfund generally. And so it triggers all sorts of requirements at contaminated sites that are currently regulated under the Superfund program, as well as sites that could be added. So until a chemical is added to the hazardous substance list, it can't really be regulated under the Superfund program. So now any site that has the presence of PFOA or PFOS could now be designated a Superfund site where it couldn't be in the past. As well as there are many sites that are currently designated for other chemicals where we know it's present, and so now it will be able to be addressed as part of the Superfund regime. In addition, as I mentioned, we'll talk about here, is this has an effect on due diligence for property transactions, because the list of hazardous substances under CERCLA is essentially the key to what you look for in a phase one and phase two environmental site assessment, an ESA, which is a standard part of most real estate transactions. And we'll get back to that a little later. But the other major development at the federal level was under the Safe Drinking Water Act. And so this is the act that sets drinking water standards across the United States for numerous types of contaminants. And so previously, PFAS contaminants were not regulated in terms of a mandatory level. There were various, notification levels and goals that were being set, but not a mandatory level that public drinking water systems had to comply with in terms of, a maximum level. And so in 2024, the Biden administration passed a maximum contaminant level, an MCL is what it's known as, for 6 PFAS chemicals. And they were set very low, between 4 and 10 parts per trillion for each of these contaminants. And which means that public water systems within a few years need to be able to meet that level and ensure that the drinking water in their system does not contain these chemicals above those levels. Now, what we've seen with respect to both of those with the Trump administration is that there is at least a partial rollback going on. So what I just mentioned about the MCLs, the Trump administration made a decision to actually revoke 4 of the 6 MCLs. So now they kept 2 of them. So for PFOA and PFOS, they did maintain them. So there is now still a maximum contaminant level that will come in soon at 4 parts per trillion for each of those 2 chemicals. On the CERCLA Superfund designations, it's up in the air right now. There's several court cases pending where EPA has submitted papers to the court asking for a stay of the litigation while they consider what they're going to do with those Superfund listings of PFOA and PFOS. We don't know for sure. They could remain in place. They could get revoked. They could get postponed. So we'll wait and see. But at least as of right now, they are in place. And so we're working from the assumption that in particular, if you're doing a real estate transaction right now, that affects the way you would approach it. And so one of the major issues with, for example, the levels at issue here are very low. 4 parts per trillion is a very, very low concentration. And so, major issues that come up from the regulatory perspective, both with respect to, say, the Safe Drinking Water Act and testing in water, or if you're testing products, even, that the levels that are going to be required in products are very low as well, is, how do you actually test and make sure that you're testing appropriately and you're using the right methodology and you're excluding things that could contaminate, for example, at that very low level. As Adam said, PFAS pretty right, and so you have to really what the concentration is in water or in a product, that when you're doing the testing itself, that you're abiding by some very strict protocols. And we were just talking recently to one lab. There is, this lab actually set up an entirely separate lab within their lab to test for PFAS, because they needed the things they use in other labs, parts of their lab actually have PFAS in them. And so they had to kind of create a whole new lab that doesn't use those products that contain PFAS, and it's really monitored at a very careful level to ensure that there's no contamination. And so that's really, it becomes an issue where the technical and the legal piece really end up merging, where you have to really pay close attention, whenever you're doing testing, and we'll talk about testing, later, that, you're looking at what's the lab that's doing the work and making sure that they have the correct protocols, that they basically, have a reputation for doing this at a level that is reliable. And in particular, if someone is presenting you with purported lab results from some lab they've hired, obviously you're going to want to scrutinize that and question whether or not, for example, if they purported to find PFAS in a product, whether or not, it was truly there, or maybe it was contamination, for example. So there's all sorts of technical issues that come into play when you get to the, are we in compliance with regulations and legislation? And if someone's making a legal claim, is there really a legitimate legal claim here? The lawyers always have to work with technical experts like Adam very closely to make sure that we're dealing with these issues in a way that, is protective of our clients. So I think with that, I think what I'll do is maybe briefly just talk about the real estate piece a little bit. Then we'll close out this section. We'll turn off the recording after that so that we can have a Q&A session, and we can have it without being recorded, so people can feel free to ask questions and not worry about being preserved in perpetuity. But I'll talk briefly just on the real estate side. If you're talking about acquiring at this point, say land for vineyard purposes, or you're thinking about acquiring a winery operation. A normal part of that process, if land is involved, is going to be doing environmental due diligence. And, that's usually a requirement. If you have bank financing, they're going to require that you do a phase one environmental site assessment, which is kind of standard paper review where an environmental consultant comes in, looks at, the operations on a site, looks at the history of what went on there before the current operations, and then looks at regulatory agency files and decides whether or not there's a risk that there may be an environmental contamination issue at the property. And then usually the result of that phase one is either, no, we don't really see a risk. There's nothing that we call a recognized environmental condition, an REC or a REC. Or they say, yeah, there is an REC, a REC. And if you find a REC in a phase one, then you're supposed to do a phase two environmental site assessment. And that's where you get into actual testing of the environment to see whether or not that potential environmental risk actually exists. So where things have changed recently due to federal law is the addition of PFOA and PFOS to the CERCLA hazardous substance list means that it now comes within the ambit of a phase one environmental report, which it did not before, at least as a mandatory element. Before you could test for it, you could ask a consultant to do it, but it wasn't required for it to meet the standard that's been set for what is a legally and regulatorily compliant phase one report. So as of last year, now people need to start looking for PFAS, at least two of them, PFOA and PFOS, to see whether or not they are present as part of the environmental due diligence process if you're doing a phase one and the phase two. So what's happened is, what before was really kind of a theoretical risk in terms of, are we going to find it if we look for it? Should we think about looking for it? Well, if you weren't doing a transaction, and if you're not now, that's still a question: is should you be doing testing? But if you're doing a transaction previously, you could, if both parties were amenable to it, kind of ignore the PFAS issue and say, okay, we're not going to look for it. It's kind of a don't ask, don't tell situation. Nobody wants to know that there's PFAS present because it just raises all sorts of concerns. But certainly now it's now required as part of that transactional process. And so when you combine that, with the risk we're talking about here that Adam talked about with, PFAS in products, which can give rise to liability in contexts, which have to do with things like, personal injury claims, or claims of exposure to chemicals, or whether or not you're properly labeling your product. I should mention that under Prop 65, as you may know, that some PFAS are listed as Prop 65 chemicals. And so there is the question of, whether or not, if it's present, you would definitely need to warn about it. So, there's questions that go now on both on the product side in terms of, potential liability related to PFAS, and then on the transactional side, there is liability potentially there that will need to be dealt with in the transaction process. And there are ways to deal with that, but it's definitely becoming more of an issue now because it is now, essentially every transaction that involves environmental due diligence needs to address this issue, at least in some manner. So I'll leave it there. Margaret, why don't we go ahead and turn off the recording, and then we can open it up for questions.